I'm just delighted to be here today with Gabriel Stuckey. I came across Gabriel on a talk that he did with Paul Vanderklay, and I was fascinated by Gabe's mind and the way that he takes things apart and puts them back together again in very interesting conformations. So we're going to have a talk today about some of his theories and maybe talk about some of the other people that he could connect with to talk about some of his theories on this little corner of the internet, so to speak. And but first, Gabe, I would like you to just give a brief introduction to yourself and how you came to be the kind of person that got interested in all these various theories.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm 38 years old. I got 4 kids, happily married, just as kind of the rough outline there. And then as far as what got me into this, I think I went over it somewhat talking with Paul, but what really got me into it was just not really having an intuitive understanding of how things worked. I had a hard time. I think part of it too was just not having as many people to talk with as a child, especially about the harder questions, even growing up in church. And we were Wednesday night, twice on Sunday kind of family. So got a lot of that, but there wasn't really room for questions, and especially not hard questions. And I had a lot of hard questions that needed answering. And, but we weren't allowed to watch a lot of TV. So I did read a lot when I was younger, and I saw these stories made sense, and the patterns made sense, and things made sense. And I was just struggling to understand why it didn't make sense in my life. But I could see that it did. There was a way that things would work. There was a way that at least intuitively in that child's mind, that there could be this order to things. There could be sense made in the stories that I loved. So that was kind of the early stages, and then being kind of an introspective, moody child through a lot of my life, kind of just led me down a path of self-reflection and self-criticism in a lot of cases, which wasn't necessarily healthy, and just trying to figure out what was wrong with me. I kind of always assumed, based on some of my early experiences, that there was something wrong with me. That's why I couldn't figure out how to integrate with the world around me and the people around me. I struggled to develop relationships and to really connect with people on a deeper level. And so I think that pointed self-criticism kind of put me in a position where I could analyze very deeply how I worked, and where, hopefully, to identify where the errors were as well. So I over time developed a sense of how I was put together and how my mind worked and how I thought and how I interacted with the world and where the inconsistencies were. And it took a long time to figure out that there were issues that I had, but other people also had issues. And so you run into dealing with 2 imperfect people, and so you kind of have to account for each other's idiosyncrasies in order to be able to communicate with each other. And so that was something that getting married definitely helped with, because I married someone who was quite a bit different from me. And so in the process of figuring out how to be in a marriage relationship, and then children coming as well, and seeing these unique little personalities enter into the world, it helped me realize that it wasn't all me. I didn't need to blame myself for all the issues I was running into, and really recognizing too that the variety of personality that was out there in just seeing my children come, and of course the daily interaction with other people as well, but just trying to integrate that all in a way that made sense and that was functional, something I could use, something I could apply. And I think that's the best way I can think to put it. I was looking for, being someone who was always working with my hands and always using tools. I was looking for a tool. I was looking to design a tool that would help me kind of organize the thoughts in my head. So what you see in those pictures is me trying to trying to put things in a place that makes sense, because I have a hard time remembering names of things, and certain aspects of just remembrance and memorization I struggle with. So I put them in these structures, and I'm able to remember things conceptually much more easily. So as I organize the concepts and organize the structures and kind of draw them out visually, it's much easier for me to remember those things. So it was, in a sense, a practice as well for me to try to put it in a format that would help me remember and help me function, and also just the desire to discover and the desire to understand. Is really just, it's fascinating. People are a fascinating subject, and I was my first one. So,
Well, I noticed that the first thing that attracted me to your Twitter page was a text that you had done early part of January, where you were exploring modeling space and the outside and inside and time and space, and you were looking at that. It seemed like you were looking at something that was related to the standard model with quantum particles.
mhm.
And then on the other side, the one that you showed when you were talking with Paul was a very elaborate sort of a flower structure that talks more about cognition and personality and the internal workings of a person, it seems to me. Those seem to be two very separated things. So could you tie that together for me?
Yes, absolutely. I think you printed out one of the pictures. You'll see
I
this
did.
little one at the
Yes.
bottom there.
Yes, I printed out this big thing here. So
So
maybe we'll go over this first.
that shape um, is basically it is this shape in the flower. So you see the substance aspect is actually referencing the space-time. So I think a better way, because I look at this in the sense of the cycle of cognition, but I also look at each one of these as almost a realm, if you want to call it that way. And we have the substantial realm, which is the space-time that we interact with. And so that's the tie-in there. Like that page.
Well, now you can see it, right?
Yes, there it is.
Okay. So this I can expand. So you're saying that these
They can best be understood as
these
toroids.
these forms here, they're kind of like eggs. And
Yes.
they have like form at the bottom, number 3 at the top here.
Yeah, which
So
is
that's
up.
masculine and feminine.
Yeah, it's tilted about 90 degrees. Will technically goes at the top, but it's meant to rotate. So just as a point of reference for other people, I kind of look at the number 1 and the number 10, the beginning and the end.
Oh, I see. So it has to be in the right. Yeah, there's nothing I can do about that right now.
That's okay. That's all right. But as kind of a little more context, when I initially started this, something like 12, almost 13 years ago now, my preliminary interest was in physics, primarily. And so I was mostly working on that for a long time, just trying to catch up on my education and understanding, and just watching a lot of videos and reading a lot of articles and listening to a lot of podcasts, and trying to build my knowledge in order to kind of fill in and help me understand what it was I was looking at and what it was I was aiming at. And to try to understand, this question I had was initially, what if there was only space and time? What would it look like? And the intuition I had was kind of the idea of oil and water, two laminar flows connected by a turbulent flow. So if you think of two laminar flows, the only way they can truly communicate is if a turbulence forms between them. So if you have the inside and the outside, the space and the time, having those two, we'll call them fluids. I wouldn't necessarily classify them that way specifically, because I don't know exactly what they are, but having those laminar flows of inside and outside, and then it's the turbulence, it's the twisting into one another that gives us the structure. And so the idea was that these two things interacting according to a certain set of laws would be sufficient for the complexity we find based on what we see in the standard model and things like that. So that was kind of the direction I was going, just struggling with this idea of space and time. And there is something that nagged at me, is if you think of mass and charge, and they're very, very closely tied, because you don't find charge without a mass, so far as I'm aware of. And so they're very closely tied. But if you think of them in the sense of Newton's third law, and that charge and mass are inverse, have an inverse relationship to acceleration. So
Well, maybe we can bring that one in. I could get that on the screen right now, because you have that on your Twitter feed as well, and we could be looking at that illustration. But do you want to do this illustration first, or do you want to do the other one first?
Probably that one, because it gives a little bit more of the backstory. So if we kind of move along according to the time that it happened, but yes, that would be easier to explain using that image, because it's a simple little thing, but it was something that nagged at me and I could never resolve. I never figured out how to resolve. So it's kind of born out of trying to understand what that meant. And it'll be the...
Let me see if I can. Can you see now? This is a Gmail page. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, then I can get to your Twitter feed. And
okay.
Let's see.
And do you have the page with the formulas on it? Yeah, just
here.
Perfect.
Can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
All right. And the one on the left is kind of what I was referencing, and it is difficult to kind of understand without looking at it. But if you kind of simplify the equation, you end up with a situation where you can redefine force as a dimensionless factor, which in my mind, based on Newton's third law, gives you an equal and opposite reaction. It kind of references that understanding that we had based on that law he gave us. And so what happens then is, if you use that understanding of force and that understanding of mass and charge as well, you can reevaluate all the SI units exclusively in terms of space and time. So there was a very odd thing that I never saw anywhere else and never popped up, and I maybe just don't have the knowledge required to undermine it. But what that means is every SI unit can be broken down into a term that's definable using just meters and seconds. So if you're, it's very difficult to kind of to articulate, and something I've struggled to communicate with people, because it's trying to take a new perspective on going back to the idea of there being, in the substantial realm, there being space and time, and it's the tension between them by which the structure emerges. So when you end up with electrons and positrons and quarks and things like that, it's that tension, that twisting tension, that is the structure that we see and that we measure and we interact with, and that make up this standard model. And this is my first time trying to to explain it.
You're doing fine. You're doing fine. I have a couple questions. First of all, when you got this idea, did you run it by any of your friends that are that have actually done physics of this level or this nature, or have you
That
not run
was
it by anybody yet?
not really. That was kind of the trouble I was having, is
Uh-huh.
nobody I knew had that background, and everybody I reached out to didn't really have time for that sort of thing. Because I can imagine a lot of them get a lot of these theories and these ideas and these hypotheses.
Well, I'm
Uh,
not saying it's somebody, like high profile or anything like that. I'm wondering if maybe you could talk to someone like, have you seen any of the videos that I've done with Haris?
I haven't seen those,
Okay,
but
so
definitely coming next.
Haris has a really keen, unusual mind with very unique ideas. And I think he might be quite interested in this because he's been working on something that's sort of lateral to this. And maybe I can connect the two of you.
I would love that.
Yeah.
And
So,
so to kind of that's kind of the root of the idea of the dichotomy. So it came, rather than getting too deep into, the formulas and things, that was the seed planted, was the idea of there just being space and time, whereas time would be understood as the inside and space would be understood as the outside, and it's the relationship between them which is the tension, and then that pattern
so I
applied.
really love the idea of the relationship between them being the tension because there's something very symbolic about that. But I'm wondering why you chose outside and inside as descriptors.
uh, I went through a lot of different iterations to kind of see how they would apply. And I think it's more, if you think of the two volumes of space and time occupying, they're overlapping in the space they're in, if that makes sense. It's when they interact, it's not that one is inside and one is outside, it's when they interact, they take up that's the form their relationship takes. And I chose outside and inside as, because it to me it was the most fundamental shape I could manage. Because if you are working in a 4D or 3D or even 2D space, what you end up with as soon as you draw a shape is an inside and outside and the bit between. And so I was trying to understand, if there was a property to the inside and a property to the outside, what would the, or even a set of properties, what would the interaction at the the surface look like, and what kind of shape
So
would
when
that?
you say inside and outside, you're not, there's a lot of different ways to draw that picture. So one way that comes to my mind is to have like a circle in the middle of a large square, and the circle is small in the middle, and the small circle is inside the large square. That's one way to do inside and outside. But another way to do inside and outside would be two spheres, one inside the other, but they're almost coterminous with each other. So they're like nested inside each other, but virtually the same size, but one is inside the other. Is that so? Which kind of picture do you have in your mind of
So
inside and outside?
the two spheres occupying a similar space would kind of be, if you think of laminar flow, they would be, that would be their state in a neutral state, as in not interacting. But as soon as they interact, what we experience is kind of like, if you're thinking of a sphere as it manifests in the space that we experience, it becomes something with an inside and an outside, and it's the mass on the inside and the effect on the outside. And so it's I would say that the second one you mentioned is most likely how I would look at it, sans any sort of interaction. But once the interaction happens, they take on a specific role in the relationship, if you will, where one is internal and one is external, and they have, that's kind of the orientation they have. So if you're thinking of a planet or a spheroid or a human, you have your mind and your internal experience as well as your external interactions and all the sensory data and actualization out into the world of your own actions. And
Okay, so other couple of other questions. Have you looked at Stephen Wolfram's new theory of fundamental physics?
I've listened to him in his podcasts. I haven't taken a very deep dive into what he's doing.
Uh-huh.
So I'm
Well, you
super
can
familiar with it.
start a pretty simple surface dive by just going to the, I think it's just Wolfram Physics
Yeah.
page, or Physics Project, Wolfram's Physics Project. I'll put the link in the show notes. And the reason I ask you that is that he has a very particular way of looking at space and time.
Mhm.
And he thinks of space as being made up of, space is actually, concrete isn't the right word, but space is actually not just an empty thing. It's filled with particles that are much smaller than the particles in the standard particle model. And everything is made of those particles. Everything in, I mean, space is made of those particles, and then everything that's part of space is also made of those particles. So the picture I get is that everything that is in the universe is coterminous with space, and it's all connected together. So there's nodes and edges, and the nodes are these particles, and the edges are the connection between particles. And time, the function that time has is that every time that set of particles gets into a particular form, time updates that form to a new iteration. So time is what keeps causing a new iteration. That's a very rough sketch, but so the connection between space and time is that time functions as space functions. Now I'm putting words in his mouth, but I'm collapsing a lot of things down. Space would be like the matter, and time would be like the energy.
Yeah.
So so that's one thing of space and time that I think is very interesting and might you might find helpful. And another one is from Mathieu Pajot's book, The Language of Creation.
Yeah.
He has several chapters on space and time that are very, very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is the issue I've kind of run into that's makes it kind of hard to understand how the picture I'm trying to draw is because I'm coming at it in a way, the way I'm looking at it is that time and space are equivalent in a lot of ways. And so far as I can tell, I would think of them as four-dimensional hyperspheres, each one of them. And so each has four dimensions. And I know our experience of space and time is a single dimension of time and three dimensions of space. But what my model and what I've been trying to kind of play out and see why it seems to make sense, at least to me, is the idea that though we experience three space and one time, it's that connection between inside and out where that fourth dimension seems to by necessity exist. Because if you have a solid sphere or a solid surface of a sphere, it is in a sense a hard boundary between the inside and the outside. So what you're looking for is a connection, is a pathway between the inside and the outside. So if you think of a magnetic field, it travels from the center to the outside, and it so it and so there's that, it seems to be that pathway where it passes through those surfaces in some way or another. So what the way I'm looking at it is that fourth dimension in each case is the dimension along which that twisting happens, where you can move kind of like a Klein bottle, you can move from the inside to the outside along that pathway while experiencing the things as three-dimensional with this single unit of time. And a lot of that I'm still in the process of working out. But I think what I struggle is to really just to share the base concept, and I've that's what all the drawings are for. Just trying to put it in a way that I can put the picture into someone else's head. But I think that would be the way I would describe it, is two hyperspheres interacting.
Could
And
you explain to me? I'm not a physicist, so could you explain to me what a hypersphere is?
it's a four-dimensional shape. So if you think of a three-dimensional sphere,
Mm-hmm.
it has that standard inside and outside, and that's how we experience the world. And a four-dimensional sphere is kind of like, are you familiar with the Klein bottle?
Yes.
So it allows, so if you, in a three-dimensional sphere, you can move lengthwise and crosswise and up and down. And what I'm speculating is that that fourth dimension is where you have length, width, and height. You also have a measurement from inside to out. So you're able to pass that boundary. What we experience as a solid surface in three dimensions is actually porous in a sense of the word in the fourth dimension. So there are those pathways for the interaction of inside and out. And that's the pattern I applied in the larger flower model, which is the kind of internal and external aspects of being. And so in the substance aspect of space and time, I was looking for a shape that allowed that transference from what we experience as a solid surface in three dimensions, that allows that transference of energy or magnetic fields or whatever it is, to move inside and outside, so that you can actually, because at its base level, you need to be able to interact. The two spaces need to be able to interact past that boundary. And so there has to be a pathway. And so the fourth dimension allows that pathway, whereas in three, the surface is solid. In four, there is, and this kind of touches into the twister theories and the ideas of the, I think, what is his name? Like I said, I'm bad with names. Peter Voigt and Roger Penrose, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yes.
and I wouldn't presume to be able to explain what they're doing, but the concepts of, I think Peter Voigt talks about a twister space, which is, yeah, I don't even know if I should try to explain that. I don't know, but having that fourth dimensional pathway and having that space where these shapes that we keep finding in physics and mathematics, when you're dealing with things like quaternions, they seem to be there, and they seem to make sense of what we're measuring and what we're experiencing as we try to map out the physics. But what I'm trying to do is to draw the shape that makes sense and has the pathways for those things to happen. And
Well, let's go back to your black and white here, and see. Probably that one's too small. Let me,
and if you do have access to the color one, it would probably, the colors do help make sense of
well,
the model.
let's just start first with one in black and white here, since I've got this up. Let's start with number one, shall we?
Okay, sounds
So
good.
that's right here. I'm going to put it in the center. It's a little bit upside down, but the printing is neat enough that people should be able to see what you're doing here. So it might, my mouse is a little imprecise. There we go. So you have the effect, and the affect. And you have the number one and then the consciousness. So what do the numbers represent in the circle?
The numbers are actually related to it's something that emerged later on, which was another little brain worm that just wouldn't let go of me, is I found that each one of these 10 tensions coincided with the 10 commandments. And I found that if you look at these 10 tensions separately, as I do, in terms of a motor structures, 5 motor structures and 5 sensory structures, if you follow the cycle, each one of those is a commandment. So the first 10 apply to the sensory structures, and so they fall in cycle based on an understanding of those 10 commandments. And the second set of motor structures follow in cycle in order, 5 through 10 or 6 through 10. So those numbers are referencing actually the 10 commandments. And I look at that kind of as, if you think of the law, why were there only 10 was the question that came to mind, and why those 10 in particular. And so the intuition I had as I saw these things line up is that, like, maybe that's why there was 10. Maybe that's why they were in that particular order, because there's something deeper underneath just this list of rules that applied to the very fundamental aspect of what it means to be human. Because presumably, from written by the hand of God, they're extremely important, and I don't presume to know the depth of their importance, but I always had the intuition that they applied to something greater than just a list of rules to keep. I thought that I always wondered, and that's a question I would always have too in church that would get me in trouble, and not necessarily in trouble, but just didn't have answers for. It's like, why just 10, and why those 10, and why in that order? And those were things that people couldn't answer for me. So those are the numbers there, because they're referenced directly to each one of the 10 parts in the Decalogue, I think it's called technically. So
okay, so number one, why don't you walk us through how that relates to the first commandment, and then what this egg means?
So number one, and I've got it here too, so this will help me. So it's no other gods before me. Let me grab, I have a quick reference here to help me. Like I said, I have trouble remembering all of this stuff, so I write everything down and draw everything because it helps me keep track of it all.
That's super important. Yeah.
So the first one is, you shall have no other gods before me. And so, and everything is interconnected. So it's building out those connections and trying to understand the complexities of the model that take a little time, but once the shape starts to form in your head, I think hopefully people will start to see what I mean. But so consciousness is associated with hearing. You see that just to the left of the number one, that's here, and that's a part of the pathway, the outside and inside pathway by which these different structures, these different tensions interact with each other. And so hearing is the sense I associated with consciousness, which relates to, I feel, the medium of consciousness is music, which in my experience and study and just is music is something that touches the consciousness very directly. And it's associated with hearing. And so that's kind of just a brief sky high view of why I linked those things together. And then the reason it linked with the first commandment in my mind was, if you listen to the wrong voice, you will turn the wrong way. And so if you look just above where you're looking, the connection between consciousness and the will is the pathway of turning. So if you hear, you have to hear in order to turn. And depending on what you hear that grabs your attention, you turn towards that thing. And so consciousness is the realm of hearing and turning. Because this is all tied into how we interact. So the tensions are the structures of that we exist within, and the pathways are the way in which we interact with them and the way they're tied together within us, if that makes sense. So that first one is consciousness is the structure for hearing and turning. I think is the best way to sum that up.
So the tensions are the structures we exist within, and the pathways are the way they interact within us.
Yeah, so if you think of the space-time realm, we exist in it and we are made up of it. And if you think of the consciousness realm, and this is something that's become more popular, is that idea of what's the word? Not a meta conscience, but a panpsychist. I don't know what the theme is, but the idea of that consciousness being a substance that, or a something that proliferates through the universe. So if you think of these overlapping realms of space-time, which we are made of and we exist in, and consciousness, which we are made of and exist in, I think the idea is each one of these tensions is a realm of which we are made, in which we exist. So there's a part of the universe in each one of these 10 tensions that exists within us and within which we exist. So there's a larger, I guess just to put it simply, a larger version, and then we are a small little whirlpool of that same pattern that is conscious of itself.
Okay, so going around the outside of this structure here is believe and question. Are you seeing those as
Yeah.
opposites or as just part of the same process?
So once you get inside that little structure, you'll see consent as the center. So that's the tension between the inside and outside, the affect, which is the internal, and the effect, which is the external. So the effect would be what you're experiencing coming from outside, and the affect is what you're experiencing internal. And consent is the tension between them as you operate on what you're feeling and what you're experiencing, and it's a relationship, and each one of these I think is best thought of as a relationship.
Well said, but when you let's back it up. When you use the word consent, are you using that in the sense of agency, or are you using that in the sense of submitting to or permitting?
I picked each one of these words because there were so many things that I felt like it did. I think in both senses, it is the case, what you said. Consenting in the sense of one submitting to the other in an effort to balance, because balance is, I think, at the core what is most important. So if you think of the logos, if you are in line with the logos, then you are in balance, or you are as close to in balance as you can be. So consent is a mutual submission, while at the same time asserting yourself, your outer aspects and your inner aspects, asserting themselves in a relationship, while also at the same time submitting in a way that allows you to create that balance and to achieve logos, at least in that particular aspect of consciousness. And you see those petals going out, and those broader sections out at the edges, that moves into the idea of measuring whether or not you are in or out of balance. So I think a mutual submission would probably be a good way to look at that in terms of the word consent. That was definitely along the lines of what I was going for with that word.
Okay, so we have believe and question, and then we have consent.
Yes, and the believe in question is those outer sections can be looked at the ways that the inside and outside communicate. So the outside brings So if you're taking in, it brings in questions, and the inside establishes belief. And so their communication between the external and internal consciousness is a back and forth of questioning and belief in order to establish.
Okay, so when you use the word believe, are you using that in the sense of this question has come in, my affect is working on the question in various ways in the consciousness, and then the believing portion would be acting upon what I now, the answers that have come to me from the question, so that the effect comes out of the acting upon? Is that what you mean by believe?
Maybe less acting upon and more like if you taking in the question, and the answer you come to is kind of the way I would classify the belief. So it's like, as the question comes in, using what you have in yourself to form an answer and push that back out to the outside for evaluation, I guess is the best way to put it, because internally you're limited. If you think of yourself as that sphere, and on the inside you're processing these things, but what you have inside the sphere is what you have inside the sphere. So you form that answer to the question, and then it comes back out for testing.
And
So
the testing takes place in the effect part, where you're affecting the world.
Yes, because you have to. If you develop a worldview or a perspective on one thing or another internally, in order to test whether or not that is accurate or useful, at the very least, it's useful and effective. You have to express that. You have to actualize it in some sense.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, so I mean, that's the place where believing becomes action, basically, is in
yeah,
the effect. Yeah.
yeah, and then looking at those two smaller, like egg-shaped pathways, those are what I call the editing pathways. And so in the physics sense, what you're dealing with on those pathways is the W bosons, because it's by that W boson relationship that things like antineutrinos change into positrons, or neutrinos change into electrons, or quarks change from up to down. It's that W boson relationship. So what you're looking at in the physics sense, is the editing pathway for matter and changing its properties, is that W boson pathway. So in the case of consciousness, let's see here. Yeah, yeah. So in the case of consciousness, the editing
Let me just clarify. The editing pathway would be when you take the belief, you are now experimenting with the belief in your action to see if it fits if it's valid according to the reality.
yes,
And then this editing pathway is that process of testing, getting closer and closer and closer to the truth as you continue to test.
yes. It's kind of the, if you look at the outside section of believe and question, that's kind of the communication lines. And if you look at those tighter ones, that's almost kind of the argumentation. It's the back and forth of changing the shape of the thing that you're going to put out as your belief. So it's a mechanism, kind of like with how it is with the physics, the W boson pathway. It changes the shape and the properties of the particle or the molecule or whatever it is, and by doing that, that's the way you edit, in order to, if you come up with an answer, if you have a question that affects things in a particular way, you can. And this comes into the idea of where free will would exist, if it exists. And that whole argument is like, you have these mechanisms by which you can respond to the questioning and adjust the belief based on, like, using that internal argument. So if you look at those outer ones as communication and those secondary egg-shaped ones as almost an argument and a shaping that happens in the midst of trying to figure out what's true based on the updated information, because this whole thing is cyclical. So as it runs through the cycle, you get a new set of information, and each section, based on the information that comes to it, is able to adjust and make those changes according to what they think is the best way forward. I don't know if there's a better way to put that, but it's kind of a hard.
No, I like the picture. I think we've got a picture here. I apologize to everybody for this woo-woo whenever I move the screen.
Oh,
I think it's the app that I'm using. So let's go on to number 2. We're not going to get a chance to go through this whole thing, but at least we'll give people an idea of how your mind worked when you were putting this together, so that they have a picture to work with.
absolutely.
So number 2 is substance and time and space. So
Yes.
the first one was,
It may be better
so
to.
you made number 1. That's very interesting. You made number 1 affect and effect. So you made consciousness primary.
Yes.
Okay, and then space and time comes after consciousness.
Yes, but I don't think we should skip over number 10, because like I said, the
Oh, you have these in order. I see. I thought they were in order according to the numbers. Sorry.
no, they're in order because 1 through 5 are sensory and 6 through 10 are motor. So if you think of motor and sensory structures in the brain, and you'll see I've started to try to feel that out in what I have up on Twitter right now. I've tried to figure out like the certain brain structures that are more directly connected to each one of these. But yeah, so if you think of 1 through 5 as consciousness, substance, and those are the sensory structures, and then 6 through 10 are the motor structures, and they overlap each other. So they are in order, but they are separate, if that makes sense.
Okay, so what would number 10 relate to in terms of commandments?
Number 10 is, let's pull this up so I don't. Specifically, you shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. And the way I look at it is, if one turns, so if you think of the will, as you would will towards one another, and the way that I think the will works, if one turns against one's neighbor, one will look for ways to betray him. And that gets into the deeper aspects of the logos and anti-logos, which you see in the petals, dealing with the idea of will being a measure, love as a measure of will. It's like if you love someone, if you're committed to their good and their well-being, then your will is turned towards them in a positive way. But if you turn your will towards them in a negative way, the other extreme in my mind is betrayal. And if you think of Dante as betrayers were at the very bottom of hell in the deepest parts, and that made sense to me because love is held as the highest in that sense, and betrayal, at least metaphorically, is held at the lowest. And so when you turn your will against someone, you will seek out opportunities to betray them. But when you love someone, you will turn your will towards their good and their well-being and their growth and development. So that's why when it comes to coveting, like who can actively love their neighbor while simultaneously spitefully desiring something their neighbor has. So it's like, how can your will be positive towards someone who you've sought to betray in order to take what they have via that state of covetousness? So that, to me, the covetousness seemed to me very directly related to your relationship and your will towards others.
Yeah, that's really quite an interesting thought. Yeah, there's about 10 levels underneath there. So
Yeah,
let's
that's
just
why
keep going here. the embrace on the outside, you have embrace and sacrifice. Now, that's also an interesting dichotomy there. Could you tie those together for me?
So I think the simplest way to think of it is when you embrace something, you take it in, and when you sacrifice something, you give it up. So as you're taking in, there's everything. Everything is a trade-off. I think Thomas Sowell has a good quote about that, but I couldn't say it specifically without paraphrasing. But everything is a trade-off. There's always
Oh yeah, I
trade-offs.
mean it's the whole opportunity cost
Yes.
aspect of sacrifice, because every choice that you make, you're giving up everything else that could happen in that moment. So
Yeah.
really everything that we do is a sacrifice of some sort, but there's sacrifices that we choose to make often for our own benefit. But when you make a sacrifice for someone else's benefit, it's because you're willing their good
Yes.
in your own. And
Yeah.
so the
Very.
things maybe the things that you give up take on more weight because you're not looking for the benefit that's there for yourself, but you're looking for the benefit for the other person.
Yeah, and that's why I had sacrifice in the outward direction, because you are giving up, and whether it's for your own progress or someone else, the effect of that, and it is balanced with that embracing, because as you take things in, as you take hold of things, as you embrace things, presuming the trade-offs that are in place, you have to give something up just by nature. So it's in a willful and active approach, you think about what it is you're taking in and what it is you're giving up and why you're doing those things and what reasons you're doing them for. So that's the relationship I would see between the embracing, because as you take in, you have to give up, because there's only so much, I don't know if space is the word, but there is
Now,
always.
as you're saying that, it fits in my mind so beautifully with order and entropy.
Yeah.
Because as more order is created, some order has to be given up. That's just the way the universe works. You have to give up that order, and that's why entropy is always increasing.
Yes.
So that's a very, very interesting way to put that.
Yeah, and if you see in substance as the next section, I actually use gravitation and entropy as extremes in a sense. But before we get to that, it's important to note the pathways. So we had hearing is the pathway into consciousness, and turning is the pathway from consciousness into will. And from will, you hear, you turn, and you look. So the will is looking, whether you think in the sense of where you want to go, what you want to aim at. It's looking to willfully turning towards in the direction of what you've heard and how you've decided to think about what you've heard, how you've decided to interact with the answers you've come up with between that question of belief. Like as you take in the question and you establish your belief, you turn according to what you've chosen in that space to your will, and your will is a motor aspect, whereas consciousness was a sensory aspect, a taking in. The will is a putting out. So you have the turn and look. So you're actively, and some of the brain spaces that I've associated with this are the ones that control the eye movement and the neck movement, like pointing the head in one direction or another. So you're actively looking toward or away from, if you see that little look or ignore. So there's that little pop off underneath look. So you have this kind of dichotomy of choices between looking or ignoring based on what you heard.
So look or ignore is over here in the lower left corner.
Yeah.
So turn comes in and then comes into will and goes around like this. And then, well, I guess embrace is going into the will. So why is it exclusive and inclusive on the outside here?
So the way I think of that is when you think of, as you mentioned before, willing the good of another, by doing so, you're including them in in a sense in yourself and in your goals, in your state, in your will. It is, you are broadening the scope of what and who is included in your will, whatever that looks like. And in the case of, say, a mother with her family, she's cautious about who she includes, willfully includes in that home. If you look at the home as the will, who she allows, who she includes in that space, who she includes in the identifier as family, and who she excludes based on the goals of her will and the well-being that she is most prioritized, which would in that case be her children. So the well-being of her children being a priority, she will wrestle between that tension of including and excluding and deciding what the shape of family is and moving accordingly based on her will, as defined by what she's determined to include or exclude.
Okay, so I notice here in the structure that when we're coming out of will, there's an arrow with invest going first and then moving over to integrate and coming back in again. But on the other side, when it's inclusive, it starts with integrate and then it moves to invest. Is there a reason that those two are in opposite order?
So I look at that part. There's not. If you look at the little arrows, it's in the outward moving. So you have on the lower side, you have invest, which moves into the tension space, and invest, which moves to the outside space. So if you think of, if you return to the physics, which is helpful in understanding this, if you have the W plus boson and the W minus boson, and if you want to change the neutrino into an electron, you emit you emit a W plus or you absorb a W minus. So there's those two directions of the plus moving outward and the minus moving inward. And the way I look at the W pathways is a twisting inward and a twisting outward. So in the case of will here with the invest and what was the integrate, the integration is a twisting inward. So you're twisting from the outside into that tension and from the tension into that inside, and then from the inside into that tension in which there is communication, and from that tension to the outside. So those are the pathways where you can edit that space and move between, it is the argument, the conversation, the tension between the inside and outside.
So when it's inclusive, the integrate is coming in and the invest is going out.
Yes.
It's exclusive, the integrate is coming in.
Oh, I see what you're
going in and the integrate is going out. Do I have that right?
See what you're saying. Yeah, that was something there was, like, speaking of trade-offs, there were it was difficult to kind of pick what to make as clear as possible and what wasn't. So I see what you're saying now. So with the sacrifice being on the side of invest and the embrace on the side of integrate, the only relation really is that they're aimed inward, and that's why they're on the same side. But the communication can go both ways, so they're not necessarily on one side or the other for any reason other than that they're, one is communicating inward and one is twisting inward, and the other is communicating outward and the other is twisting outward. So just trying to kind of associate those with the movement.
Okay, so then you have, is it conduct or conduct that's in the middle there?
That was honestly, that was one of the harder ones to land on, because I was kind of channeling Vervaeke and trying to come up with the 10 C's. And I think it's, again, each one of these tension words almost have two meanings, kind of like you pointed out two different meanings that were that were reasonable and worked in both ways. This one, I think, works with both, as you said. So you conduct yourself, so, which is the acting out of the will, and your conduct is based on the decisions of your will. So I think it's both behavioral as well as actual. And so I think each one of these words I just had anxiety over trying to pick the perfect one.
Well, I mean, I can see the care that you've taken with this whole thing is just amazing. So I can totally see that. So you wanted to get over here to this substance one. So we probably have just enough time for that. So maybe we can do that one.
So
Which is number 2.
yeah. So, and then something I failed to mention, going from consciousness into will, I have the 10 C's for the 10 tensions and the 10 R's for the 10 transitions. And so from consciousness into will, it's reformational, a reform or turning of awareness in accord with the resolution of perception of reality, which brings you back to the further back in the cycle, which is what we won't do right now. But from will to substance is representational. A discretionary focusing in response to reformation of awareness in order to represent intention accurately and thereby see usefully. So
you have that written down someplace, because I don't see that reformation and representation thing on here.
it's on when I separate all the different shapes on that Twitter list. You see,
okay.
and then it's in the text on the right side of that image, and then
Okay.
you see the little tiny image on the bottom right of each one of those, and that's the connection that's being made.
Okay.
But I wanted to note that because it is an important.
Absolutely. And that verbiage is really good. So I want to go back and get those notes. Okay. So let's go back in here to number 2.
So, and then number 2 on the Decalogue is you shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth beneath or in the waters below. And my thought on that is, if one sees something pleasing and aims at it improperly, one is made an idol of a material thing. And another way to think about that is, what gain is there in the deification of the physical platform? Like, what material thing of space and time precedes or fulfills the sustaining occupations of a living God? So the priority, it's an issue of priority. Are you worshiping the substance, or is it occupying the proper space in your mind as the platform within which you operate and the substance of which you are made? So that would be the number 2 and how I associated that.
So that's time and space.
Yes.
And so the first one was consciousness. The second in the order is will, and then the third one in the order is substance.
Yes.
And here you've gone right into the W boson with the emit and absorb.
Yes. So the emission and absorb, you'll see in the smaller one on that page with all those colorful diagrams, the Z boson and the photon. So the photon is communication within between charged particles. So you have your electron and your positron as representational of those charged particles, and the photon is the communication. So it's the emission and absorption of photons that allows the communication within that tension in the center, which is the charge. And the Z boson is one I'm still struggling with, but from what I understand, it is also a particle of emission and transmission that transports momentum in a form. I know there's a more in-depth explanation that I have in my notes somewhere, but that's essentially the idea. The more direct communication between space and time is along the Z boson pathway, and the more direct communication within that charge, that tension between space and time, which is charge, which holds things together, is the photon. So they're communication pathways in that sense. So that's where the emission and absorption comes from.
The tension between space and time is charge, and that's what holds things together.
Yes. So the way I look at that is if the relationship between space and time is one of outside and inside, and time is internal and massive. Let's see if I have. Let's see. Yeah, I think I have that on some other page. I'll have to look. Oh wait, I know where it is. Yeah, let's move to the page. So if you think of time as inside with the properties of left-handedness, momentum, seconds, and gravitation, and space as the outside, right-handedness, position, energy, and entropy, their relationship, though I would say they both permeate, and that kind of gets into the ideas of dark energy and dark matter. If time is a pulling together, and if you think of time dilation and things like that, interacting, the more dense the gravitational field, the more powerful, the longer the second becomes, I guess is a way to look at it. And the faster you're going, the greater your momentum, and the longer your second becomes. There's lots of videos out there that explain it better than I'm going to be able to, but if you look at that relationship between inside and outside, it's the twisting into one another that creates the charge. So if time has that property of gravitation, and it's a pulling together. So if you think of time as a pulling together, that is its primary property, and you twist that outward into space, you get a pulling together in space, which is what negative charge does, is it pulls inward. At least you can represent it in that sense, in relation to the opposite. And so in the spatial aspect is a pulling apart. So the primary aspect of space is a pulling apart. And when you twist that space into time, then you have a pulling apart, which is represented as the positive charge, which if you draw the positive lines and negative lines, you can relate them in that sense of one pulling together and one pulling apart. Except in the case of time, it's internal. In the case of space, it's external. And when you twist it into one another, then you get that property of charge, because the time aspect, rather than being internal, is suddenly, if you think of a Klein bottle, you're on the inside of the shape, you move along that four-dimensional pathway, and then you're on the outside of the shape once you've twisted into the outside. So time, rather than being internal, becomes external and pulls inward for the negative charge. Space, rather than external, becomes internal and a pushing apart, or away from itself in the positive sense. And then it is that once those are twisted into each other, it is that interaction between those twisted aspects of space and time that create the substance that we are made of. When you consider charge holding together atoms and molecules and subatomic particles and all of that. So I hope I've tried to make that as clear as I can. Again, this is the first time I've really tried to explain this, so I really appreciate your patience.
No, I think you're doing great. I'm very curious about this idea. Okay, I'm going to leave the screen. I'm going to leave the share right now so we can talk to each other, since we only have a few minutes left. I'm very interested in this idea of handedness, left-handed and right-handed in relation to time and space. So is that something that drops out of physics, or is that something that you thought of?
Yes, it drops out of physics. So if you see the colored version you printed out of that section.
Yes.
So if you look at those, you have your magnetic field, and the X at the center represents traditionally a moving away from you. So if you're looking at the screen and you see that circulation, the vector is moving away from you. So that X at the center of each one of those is pointing away from away from you
Mhm.
on the page. And so if you look at the magnetic field, if you have an electron moving, the magnetic field is going to it's going to be right-handed. And if you have a positron, it's going to be left-handed. And
Now, when you
so
say handed, you mean that it's either going clockwise or counterclockwise,
yes,
or
the magnetic field is going to circulate around the moving charge in a either right-handed or left-handed way based on the positive or negative charge, whether or not it's positive or negatively charged. The
but when
magnetic.
you use the word right-handed, are you talking
So
about
if you
moving?
so left-handed is the curl. So if you're moving in this direction, the curl is doing this. And right-handed, if you're moving in this direction, or if you're moving in the same direction, I think it's a bit easier way to think of it. The curl is moving along the line of your fingers. So left-handed, the curl is this way, and right-handed, the curl is in the opposite direction. And
Okay,
so
so it is kind of a clockwise or counterclockwise, only in a different dimension. Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
I got
And so when you think of, as I mentioned before, negative charge being a property of time and positive charge being a property of space, you would assume then that if, because they are represented with different handedness, and this ties into more specifically into the issue of neutrinos, which, as we've measured, the neutrinos are exclusively left-handed and the antineutrinos are exclusively right-handed. And there's a lot of, I mean, people are trying to discover a left-handed neutrino, but I think they are closely tied in the sense that their handedness uh, identifies them with either space or time. And because the neutrino is associated with time and is exclusively left-handed, that's why I made, in my model, I made that left-handed, and why in the anti-neutrino I made right-handed, or it is right-handed. And so the spatial aspect with which the anti-neutrino is associated is right-handed. And then you see that reflected in the twisting in and forming of charge and the curl of the magnetic field. So and then I separated those. The magnetic field is a spatial effect. So if you think of the way we interact with magnetic fields, they're field lines that move in space, whereas spin, which I associate with the temporal aspect, is something that is internal or a property of the unit itself. So you could think of that as an internal, whereas the magnetic field is an external effect. So that again is the inside-outside space and time relation that seems to emerge.
Yeah, this is really cool, because the whole idea of handedness shows up as well in the origin of life discussion and in the evolution discussion, because when they're trying to build cells now, cells have a natural handedness that doesn't
I
just
think it's
arise when they're building cells mechanically, or else they get all one hand, or they get too much of a random mixture, and they don't get the handedness that arises in life. And so there is a very particular ratio of handedness for everything.
yeah. I think it's down to the proteins as well as how they fold. It's like if they fold into a right-handed position or a left-handed position or form, then they either are or are not compatible with whatever it is you're trying to build.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Wow, this has been really terrific, Gabe. I thank you for being so patient with me and answering my questions, because I know what it's like to get your flow of thought interrupted, but you've managed to pull it back together and be very coherent in your explanations.
Well, I had, when I first found you, like I said, I kind of had that intuitive moment of a kindred spirit, and I was like, this feels like somebody who has a broad enough interest and is open enough, who would take the time to try and let me sort of bumble my way to an explanation. So I'm really just over the moon with how this went because it really is. I've had this same experience at trying to explain it to everyone else, but no one no one before has had the patience and put in the effort you have in this short time we had together to really take the time and understand. So it's immensely meaningful to me that
Well,
you
I know what it means to have the opportunity to try to explain it, because you can have thoughts in your mind, you can even write about it. But when you start trying to articulate it to somebody, it gets
uh,
all jammed up in there. And I've talked on a number of my other episodes about this picture that I have in my mind of how the universe works. And it's kind of a four-dimensional picture, and I have absolutely no idea how to illustrate it visually. I've had glimmers of it when I look at things like projective geometry. Maybe I could use some of that as part of the illustration, but I think what you've done is really a tour de force, that you've found a way to connect all these ideas. The thing that I see that makes it really challenging is that you're taking so many very dense and difficult concepts and trying to put them into one container. There will be very few people who will probably have the patience to try to understand what it's about. So it almost seems as though it's something that you would have to write a book about at some point.
yeah, I'm actually on my, let's see, where's the other one? I'm on my fourth book that I'm working on now. And
Okay.
these are all out of date, so they're no longer in print. So I'm working on the fourth one, trying
Okay.
to explain it because it
I
really is.
mean, just to find a way in, so that, because once a person becomes engaged with it, they'll latch on and they'll take hold and they'll follow you all the way through. But to get people engaged is really a challenge, right?
That has absolutely been the primary challenge. I feel like there's a certain amount of providence to it that I haven't had the opportunity before, because I think now I am at least able to be coherent
Mhm.
and I have the maps and the drawings that allow me to kind of point to the pathways and point
Mhm.
to the connections. So I think I'm finally in a space where I can start to explain it to people and anybody who's interested. I love questions, I love critique, and I want to qualify it. I'm not trying to, like you said, the term container. I'm not trying to fit everything into one thing. I'm looking for the pattern and I'm looking for the shape, because I think visually, I think in shapes, I think spatially. Like I organize my thoughts and I organize the things I've learned spatially in that way. So I'm trying to refine all of that in a way that is transferable.
Well, so if you took the whole thing and you simplified, right? If you could simplify this all down to one simple idea, have you thought about that yet?
I
Something that
think
you could put into one sentence?
I I think I have not dialed that in to that point, and it's definitely something that comes and goes. And it's almost, it's funny you say that. It's almost like a checkpoint of how far have I come, is how clear a statement like that would be. But I have the intuition that it will have something to do with that inside outside relationship. It's like you're dealing with two equals, whether it's space and time, or the inner and outer, the affect and effect consciousness. You're dealing with two equals, and then especially so in terms of form, where you have that separation of masculine and feminine. It's like you have these two equals, and as they interact, based on the way, according to the law of just the way things are, the way they're ordered, the way they're designed, how, whatever your perspective is, they take a certain role and they fill a certain space. Whereas initially they are equal, but in relationship they fulfill different roles, and it is within their relationship, kind of like with the space and time, you have space and time, but it is the charge, which is the relationship between them, that allows for all of the substance and the particles and the biology and the humanity that we see, just the structure of it, the substance of it. So I think something in along the lines of that inside outside relationship, while still being equivalent, and that relationship being absolutely necessary for existence in all the 10 realms, and just as we experience it.
So one of the things is that in some sense, relationship is one of the absolute fundamentals, right?
Yeah.
And then the charge, or at one point you used the word the turbulence between the two. That also seems to be a very key thing to me as I look at how things work, that turbulence is what creates that. Somebody told me once that that in a field where there are two microclimates, because little microclimates can take place even across one span of Earth, where there are two microclimates, it's the edge between those two microclimates where all of the diversification takes place in those fields. You find many more species of, bacteria and insects and small animals and everything that are along the edge in between those two microclimates, because it's where that turbulence takes place, or where that's the creative edge that goes between everything, the turbulence, the suffering, the anomalies that come into our lives, right? All of that is that edge between, right?
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
the relationship, and I like the idea that charge is the way to describe that in physics, because I've been thinking about this at all the different levels. When I get down to physics, it's harder for me to picture it. I know it's true. Like for me, one of the fundamental things that comes up is boundaries or edges, the boundary or the edge, or another way to think of a boundary as a limitation or a constraint. That's really important. It's necessary for creativity, because if you don't have a limit, if you don't have an edge, then everything just dissipates outwards, right? So and this morning I ran into this really interesting thing as I was reading the scriptures. One of my favorite verses is, "He has drawn the boundary lines for us in pleasant places." And that popped up when I was doing a study of another word that actually meant measurement. I thought, whoa, the boundary is the same thing as a measuring line.
Yeah.
When that verse says the boundary is drawn for me in pleasant places, that word boundary is the same as measuring line. So I've been correlating all of these things around measurement because of the measurement problem in physics. And measurement lines up with judgment and discernment, and it lines up with even with the theory of observation that Wolfram is working on right now, the observer.
The measurement problem and all of that.
Yeah. And so it's just interesting how all these things line up at all the different levels. And when you get a head full of that, it's really hard to try to talk to people because there's so many things jammed in there that come out all at once.
I think you'll especially like the little section on reality, the realm of reality. That is the measurement section. And you'll notice too, when you look at that in particular, you will see the scientific method expressed in those pathways, linking that together. So I think you might enjoy that aspect of it in particular.
Yes, absolutely. I will take a look at it. All this is on your Twitter feed, so I'm going to put that in the show notes as well, so people can find you. That's the Super Egonaut. Is that?
Yes, the Super Egonaut on X or Twitter. And if I have a link in my bio to my website, superegonaut.com, and any questions you want bigger answers to, or if you want PDFs or anything like that, I'm definitely open to sharing those things more directly. There's a contact form at the bottom of that that that'll allow you get in touch with me more directly as well. So
Okay, and you said something to Paul about how you didn't want people to misunderstand what you meant by super egonaut, so I thought you might want to mention that.
okay, yeah, actually, that's on my Twitter too. I I think the definition, it's a psychological term. I think I don't know if Freud was the one that came up with it, but it's the definition is kind of the norms and the. I wish I had it in front of me because I could. The way I put it simply would probably be superego as the self-reflecting aspect of the individual mind. So, but also it's something that comes to you from the Father. I think in the literal and I think also in the spiritual sense. So this idea of rules and norms and laws and you think of the logos of Christ being there at creation and the word being with God and by it all things are made. And so it's just that kind of idea of something being transferred from the Father, that image of God, whatever it was just very heavily laden in that sense for me when I really thought about it. And then not is just a suffix for voyager. So it's just kind of exploring that particular space and understanding what it, because a lot of how I've approached this is early on was trying to understand the conscience and the image of God in us. And once you get further into the petals and the more outer aspects of my design, then you can really we can start to have that conversation about what consciousness is, what our connection to it is, and how we might bear the image of God. So it's all kind of tied together in that way. But
Well, so
I think
maybe we can have another conversation in the future just to look at the outer petals. That would be very interesting to explore because you have a lot of very interesting words around the outside. And I look forward to that in the future.
absolutely, I am entirely open to that. And I've really just, again, over the moon, just how well this went. I know it feels in the midst of it kind of plodding along, trying to say these things, but just the patience with which you've approached it and the thought you've put into trying to understand what I'm saying has just been a blessing I can't articulate. I really do appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate your patience with me. And I apologize to my viewers who made it this far for the kind of stumbling beginning we had when we were trying to get things squared away as to what we were going to share on the screen. But yes, I do think it went well, and I look forward to talking with you again. And have a great interim between now and then, Gabe.
Absolutely, you do the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.